The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is charged with the idea of taking the lessons from the past and transferring them to our future.
As stewards of history in the Birmingham movement, the BCRI houses incredible collections that show and document where the community has come from and how the Birmingham movement both came to be and was so successful.
Civil rights and equality challenged today just as they were many decades ago. We are here to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past, working together in the present to build a better future.
The peaceful protest. They created what we're doing today. They created everything that their model of protest and activism is what we young people look at in order for ours to be successful.
Through many educational offerings, we teach the idea that the changes in Birmingham, Alabama were not just because of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. A lot of these changes took place because of the youth in this city. We have BCAP, which is the Birmingham Cultural Alliance Project, where we visit middle school students and we take them through this history and through this narrative so that they can prepare to understand their role in society. Through our Legacy Youth Leadership Program, we bring high school students from all over the Jefferson County area here to study this narrative and to serve as docents and ambassadors to the Civil Rights Institute.
Hello, my name is Megan Millsap. Hi, my name is Mackenzie Millsap, and we are part of the Legacy Leadership Program at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
For researchers and local students, from middle, high, and university students, they're able to come in and see where we've been so that they can go and be better stewards of Birmingham and our present and then our future.
Knowing that Birmingham has so much to do and is part of the civil rights movement is going to be very important.
So welcome home, everybody. Happy Jubilee Day. Happy Jubilee Day.
Over the last 29 years, BCRI has been an international leader in the space of civil and human rights. 2020 has brought us a multitude of challenges, but also in that same breath, so many opportunities. The ways in which we've been able to implement technology, but also be innovative, has allowed us to be able to get to this point to where we are today.
It has me excited and it has me ready to see what's next and do something tomorrow. I'm ready for what's next.
Greetings, welcome. My name is Charles Woods III, and I'm the Education Director and Trainer here at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And I'm going to say welcome to our virtual conversation series today that we're doing a continuation series with who wins the race in racism. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. The opinions expressed as part of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute presentations are solely those of our panelists and do not express the views or opinions of their affiliates. BCRI is proud to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future. Please stay connected to us. Our website is www.bcri.org if you want to schedule a tour or a program. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our moderator as well as our panelists today as we get started with our conversation. So Dr. Martez Fowles is a program coordinator for the African American Studies Department at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He is an incoming assistant professor of Black Studies in teacher education at the University of Pittsburgh. His PhD is in educational studies in diverse populations, focusing on metropolitan education studies and concentration at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He also has a bachelor's in African American Studies and History from UAB, cum laude. We also have Dr. Samantha Straton, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. And she is the interim dean of College of Education and Humanities and Behavioral Sciences at Alabama A&M University. She's also the project director of the MALE, M-A-L-E initiative, which stands for Males for Alabama Education. She has a doctorate in science education from Morgan State University, as well as a master's in secondary education in biology from Alabama A&M University. Her Bachelor of Science degree is in biology, also from Mount Allison University. Welcome and thank you for being here today. And lastly, we have Dr. Tanya Perry. She is a professor and principal investigator for both Red Mountain Writing Project and Gear Up Alabama. She is the NCTE Director of Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Color and holds a PhD in educational leadership from both the University of Alabama and the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She is the co-author of her new book, Teaching for Racial Equity and Becoming Interrupters. So I just want to say thank you all for being here. Martez, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you so you can handle the moderation for us. And thank you all again for being here.
Hello, hello, hello. It is a pleasure to have two educational leaders in front of me. I am honored to be with you all this morning, or this afternoon, rather. I just want to start by asking you both why you agreed to join this conversation.
I can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to talk about anything that I'm passionate about, which includes education, teaching, learning practices, and anything that affects our children in P to 12 public schools. And so when I was invited, I jumped at this opportunity to have this discussion. It's such a pleasure to be here with the likes of Dr. Tanya Perry from UAB. And thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Dr. Perry, why did you think today was an important conversation? You on mute, Doc. No problem.
Thank you. You know what? It seems like I would know that by now, right? I just want to thank the Civil Rights Institute for asking us both to do this session, and also to say thank you to them for asking you to moderate. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is a long-standing friend of mine, and I'm here because they asked me to do this work, and because I care so much for what they do. And shout out to the executive director and her vice president, Dr. Samantha Briggs, as well as Charles Woods. And we just want to thank them for doing this work and giving us room and space. I also do this because of the students.
Absolutely.
Every student deserves an opportunity to be successful, to prosper, to have the opportunities that have been afforded to everyone. And that's why I do this work. And that's why I'm here today, to be able to talk about how every child should have the opportunity to excel. And so we just have to take a look at ourselves and at the work that we do in the community, in our schools, and see what we can do better to make sure that everybody has that opportunity. So I'm just delighted to be here. So thank you, Dr. Fowles.
I love those responses. Thank you so much for the energy that you both bring. So I want to get right into it. The conversation is really about the history of racism in education and the ways that that history of racism in education has informed some of what we see today, some of the current policies that we're seeing, some of the current policies that we're seeing. So I want to start by first talking about a phenomenon that some folks are recognizing with Black girls and this exacerbated problem around the pipeline to prison. Some researchers have highlighted that there's a school to prison pipeline for marginalized youth. What exactly is a school to prison pipeline for folks who are unfamiliar with that terminology? And why should some parents be concerned about that, if at all?
When we think about the school to prison pipeline, we're talking about the policies and practices that are happening every day in school, that are being implemented in our public schools, and that are negatively impacting our students in a way that it's affecting their ability to not only receive proper instruction, but is also tied to penalizing them in manners where they may end up in the juvenile justice system and eventually into the prison complex. So when we look at, for instance, zero tolerance policies, if I throw a pencil and that pencil is now considered a weapon, where does that leave that particular child? So we're talking about the specific policies and practices that are happening in the public schools and how those are negatively impacting students, and for some of our students more so than others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you mind, Dr. Fowles, if I just jump right on in and add to what my scholar colleague has already stated?
Absolutely, please do.
You know, I don't want to repeat, so I'm just going to add on to some of the things that she's already stated. You know, we just wrote this book. My co-authors are Steve Zemelman and Katie Smith out of Chicago. We work together and run writing projects. But let me give you just a practical example. While we were talking to teachers about becoming interrupters and thinking about their own upbringing and thinking about their own schooling, we had two teachers. One was Vanessa, who's an amazing teacher out of California. She talked about growing up and being in class and starting a fight. And she was starting a fight with someone who was picking on her, I think, and, saying things. So she took her fist and I think she hit. There certainly was a fight, and she was a participant. The teacher pulled her to the side and told her, just sit down and calm down. Then we had another young man, a teacher, who was also amazing, a science teacher out of Chicago, Christopher. And he talked about in school, people not really appreciating him. So he had to develop this wit about him in order to stand out and to be accepted. And he got in some troubles, not even a fight, but just maybe cracking jokes, doing some things. And he was put out of school. Now, they weren't both in the same school. So from a researcher standpoint, they may have had different standards. So I can't compare school to school per se. But what I can say is that the infraction for a white female for fighting and a black male in a different place, in a different space for cracking a joke, talking, doing some things to be witty, get attention, had very different consequences. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the prison, the school to prison pipeline, really helping us think about what kind of consequences do we give children, and what is it that we are accessing and doing for children that somehow may be unfair, right? Because there's some practices in our communities, in our schools, and even sometimes in our homes. But particularly today, we're talking about mostly our systems that are already built out. What is it that we can do to really take a look at ourselves and our own practices and changing those things?
Absolutely. I think both of you all speak to some really important pieces, particularly around zero tolerance policies and the ways that we think about children, especially as it relates to how we discipline, correct, or redirect children. I also think some of these problems show up in other ways in schools outside of just the zero tolerance policies, but also the ideas that we have for excellence, the ideas that we have around academic support, all of those things also show up. I wanted to know, is there something that community members can do to support these schools as they're trying to think about policies, as they're trying to think about what's best for students? How can families engage the school in those conversations? And are schools often receptive to those types of conversations?
I can add that I think it's always important for parents, family members, etc., to attend board meetings. These are where the decisions are being made, and you would be surprised of what is being discussed at board meetings. Schedules are usually planned well in advance for the school year. Some of those meetings could even be live streamed, but it is important for community members to have their voices heard when these decisions, while these decisions are being made, while they're being discussed, while they're being debated. And so if we do that, I think that, and we've seen some of these go viral, right? Individuals attending school board meetings or board meetings and giving voice to a community where an issue may have been issue is being addressed, and we can say without a doubt, having someone there to speak up for our children is extremely important.
I agree. I agree. So the advocacy piece, I think, is important. Teaching parents and other community members how to advocate with the schools, I think, is critical. I want to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is a phenomenon that some scholars are seeing for Black girls in particular. I know both of you all experience school as young Black women, as young Black girls, and y'all understand what it means to go through a school system as a young Black girl. So I want to ask, some studies have noted that Black girls are the fastest growing population of expulsions, suspensions, and those referred to police custody and special education diagnoses. What can we do to disrupt these trends, if anything?
The Georgetown talks about in its research the idea of adultification. And this idea of adultification really does apply to Black girls, Dr. Fowles. It is treating children like adults because of your perception of them. And so we have research to support that Black girls are seen more as adults rather than any other group, right? So the idea here is that Black girls can be treated like adults, can be given responsibilities like adults, and take punishments like adults and consequences like adults. And that adultification has led to a misunderstanding and a misdirection of what Black girls, who they are, and what they're able to do, right? So going back to what you're saying, what are some things that we can do? I think we really have to look at ourselves and examine ourselves. And in what ways is it that we have this adultification about ourselves, and where does it come from? And according to the research, it says also that there are some ways in which we do and enact adultification that that we really can stop. Let me give you an example. Why would you take a Black girl and hold her hands behind her back and put her knee in her back when she did or said something in class that you consider inappropriate? That is adultification. That is teaching and treating a child like an adult. Whereas if this had been a white female student, you may have talked to her, pulled her to the side, gone to the corner, or gone to the hallway. And it's really just thinking about our own practices. Why did I do this? Why did I have this kind of reaction? And I think it's going to take some dialogue, and I think it's going to take some equity circles in schools with teachers, with parents, with communities to really think about their own policies and practices, then examine them deeply.
Thank you so much, Doc. I think you answered that succinctly. I think there are some growing trends also that we're seeing with just student support. And I think the phenomenon for Black girls is really important because as we think about what we do in schools in particular, some of the most marginalized and some of the most vulnerable students often get left behind in that conversation. So I'm super grateful to you for that. I wanted to ask about I wanted to return to some of the harsher disciplinary practices and think about the concept that you introduced of adultification and see if there are some ways that those things overlay. So as we're thinking about punishment policies and discipline policies and ways that, children on the margin are often considered, what are the conversations like when folks are creating these policies? Like what is being said in the room and how are these policies coming to the fore?
I think that's an interesting question. What is being said into the room, I'm not so sure is always rooted in research. Mm-hmm. And I think that has been the problem. The study that Dr. Perry noted is an extremely important study. That work also highlighted the fact that when you talk about biasness, stereotyping of children, particularly Black girls in that particular research study. When you talk about other issues, including poverty, et cetera, other factors that may contribute to some of the things that they cited in that research. But the conversations that probably most of us have been privy to when some of these laws or policies are being considered sometimes really includes research. And decisions are being made based on sometimes perceptions of what individuals think should happen, and that's unfortunate. And I don't know if Dr. Perry have anything to add to that, but that's a serious. That I think that question raises a serious, an important point.
You know, I really think that you've answered the question, and I think you've brought to the forefront. I just want to reiterate a point that you made that I love, how important it is that people who care about our children are at the table when decisions are being made, and also that we are proactive about them. Sometimes it's difficult when you're in the middle of something to be able to make a change, but it's very possible. But if you can be proactive about it, then I think that we're able to address some of these issues. If we know that we have a misunderstanding about our Black girls, then have that discussion before school starts. The summer's a great time. Working with the board now is a great time. Working with parents and organizing is a great time. We don't have to wait until there is an issue. Do it proactively so that you can already set our students up for success. You're on mute.
Thank you. So, look, I should have learned by now, Doc. But no, thank you both for speaking so succinctly to that issue, and thank you for speaking so critically to that issue. Another thing that I'm thinking about as we're thinking about punishment and inviting folks in the room is the role that racism, the direct role that racism plays in systems of education. So many of us, Dr. Perry and myself included, have written about the role of racist practices and policies as it relates to our youth. Dr. Perry and I have some forthcoming papers about that. And we've been thinking about this critically for a while. But I wanted to ask you both, as educational leaders and researchers, there is a very particular way that racism shows up in systems of education beyond just the pipeline to prison, but in the everydayness of the type of racism that we see in these institutions. Can y'all talk to me about some of the everyday ways that racism shows up in these institutions, in these educational spaces, and what does it look like for students? And what do you think what are some of the ways that we are speaking back to those racist systems?
I was going to let Dr. Perry take the lead on this because I know that is where the core of her work is, and then I'll just add a few points afterwards.
Thank you so much.
Well, just jump in. This is a conversation. So don't feel like you have to wait. Just, we can tag team this thing. So but I do want to say that there's a racial literacies model created by Dr. Celia Ruiz out of Columbia University. And I love the model because she talks about starting with critical love and a look at yourself, and then moving up to becoming an interrupter of these policies and practices. But you have to look through the lens of love. And then you have to also look through this humility and this reflection. And you also have to look at your own history. And then you have to do this archaeology, this dig of yourself that makes it so important. And so this model spans all things, Dr. Fowle. So I'll give you an example in the book that we just completed and just came out. We talk about how this racism surfaces. Sometimes it's very direct, but sometimes it's not. One example that we receive from teachers is that in the selection of even higher classes. So there was a discussion with two teachers trying to decide who would go in the AP the next year. The white teacher says to the Black teacher, I think the Black student, she didn't call her name, she can wait one more year. She made a B. And we need people who made A's to go into the advanced classes. And then the teacher said, well, what about student Y? She's a white female and we just let her in. She says, but I know her parents. I know she'll work hard and I know that she'll have the support. We wouldn't necessarily as teachers look at that as racist, right? But the idea here is that it is because it's rooted in practices of inequity and the idea of knowing someone that has privilege and knowing more about their histories. Therefore, we make assumptions that give them more access. And what we have to do is really dig deep and dig back and think about it through this lens. What privilege do I have? And am I given to all students equitably? Right? And sometimes when we use our own privilege and our own knowledge to make decisions rather than looking at it from an equity lens, then we make that those decisions unevenly. That's just one example of how that manifests itself. There are many others in which we have to learn and dig, but that's just a subtle one. What about the correction of language? Right? Where a student feels as if their language is not good enough from their own community. And so they're either will not speak or they're leery to speak because of the correction of language. And how do we get kids to understand and how do we as educators understand that language is valuable? It is telling, it is rich. And then how do we help students be able to understand their different languages and which language do you want to use as opposed to saying your language is not good enough?
Absolutely.
Subtle ways, but it's based in race and culture. And so those are things that we have to think about in our profession and in our communities and raise up our kids so that they understand that you are beautiful. What you have is gorgeous, right? And who you come to school as is wonderful, but we are trying to just build on what you bring to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Perry, you brought up some really important points. I think you brought up ideas around advanced placement. Earlier, we talked about even the ways that the programs that folks special education is often racialized. Behavioral and zero tolerance policies are often racialized. And I really appreciate you bringing in language because often we miss the ways that like monolingual people who only speak one language sometimes underplay folks who speak 2 and 3 and 4 languages and miss the genius and the brilliance of those folks because they haven't quote unquote mastered English, which is something that none of us have mastered. We all miss a comma every now and again, right? And so I think one of the things that is important to this conversation, I think, is our ideas about value and which cultures are valued, which people are valued. I want to also ask both of you, as you've been thinking about your own practices as educators and as teachers, there's also a way that this impacts you, right? Not just the student, but also impacts you. What does it mean to be a Black woman or Black experiencing also the same type of racism or the everydayness of the racism that we see in these schools? Both of you all, I think, were you both teachers, K-12 teachers? Right. So what did it feel like for you? Did some of that ever manifest for you?
I'm going to add to the last point we had first, and then I'm going to bridge over to what you just asked. One of the things that I always teach my students as a teacher educator is you have the written curriculum and then you have the hidden curriculum.
Ooh, yes, ma'am.
Okay. What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? What are the norms, the values, the beliefs that are going on at that particular school or in the district that is negatively impacting yourself as a teacher, but especially the students who attend that particular school or who go to school in that district? And that hidden curriculum is so important. And so when you have, as an educator, to walk into a school and have to experience some of those biases, some of those stereotyping. And I know we've been talking a lot about well, in our most recent questions about Black girls, but one of the things that one of my research areas is on Black men, especially in their experiences in teacher education, and with their experiences and sometimes being the only one at a school.
Mhm.
And what does that feel like? And how are you stereotyped? So you are seen as a security and
Mhm.
disciplinarian, and maybe
Mhm.
not so much as a pedagogical expert. And
Yes.
what does that look like? And so I think that bias and that stereotyping, particularly in education, is very important to bring out because it happens. It's very real, and that hidden curriculum plays a role in what your students of color are experiencing, those marginalized students are experiencing, and what those teachers are experiencing. And I have to have these real conversations with my students. I have to prepare them for what they may experience when they go out into public schools. And I have to be upfront with them. If you're the only one in the building, this is what you may experience. How are you going to handle that? How are we going to deal with that? What are some coping strategies? How do we address that? Because we need you in the classroom. So I think it's important to note that that hidden curriculum is extremely key to what we see going on.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate you highlighting that, because honestly, that was my experience as a K-12 teacher, right? I taught K-12 as well, and I left K-12 honestly because of that. Never being seen as an intellectual, never being seen as a teacher, always being seen as the person to punish kids and discipline kids. There are 3 questions in the audience that I'm going to try to put together. If you all would respond to them as you see fit, or as it makes the most sense for you. An educator, Brandon Hatcher, asks, how can we as teachers interrupt these practices and work to protect marginalized students without risking our job? Another educator who's a college professor, Dr. Atkins, Celine Atkins, she says, one problem that persists is how white supremacy via the academy, especially in the social sciences, feeds into the pipeline of overdiagnosing Black girls, for instance, as special ed, as well as for those suspension. These biases are symptoms of systemic issues. And then our own Birmingham Civil Rights Education Department asks, how does the anti-critical race theory legislation contribute to the systemic racism? So I think there are 2 questions. One, Brandon is asking about the individual role that teachers play and how they can do this work without losing their job. And then I think Celine is speaking to the systemic. And then the BCRI is asking about legislation. So if you can move from individual to systemic to legislation, I think that would help to kind of summarize those answers for them.
Well, what I think I'll do is I'll take the first one from Brandon Hatcher. Hello, Brandon. And we will, and then I think we can tag team some of the others.
Gotcha.
One of the things that I have found really helpful when it comes to this work is really engaging the student as collaborator in this work, as opposed to being, I don't believe in a blank slate. No such thing. Children already come to us with some knowledge, some understanding, some questions, some inquiry, something they want to know about. And I have found that when students come with questions about different things, whether it's written in their journals, whether it's written in the curriculum or not, or it's tied to something that they see on the news or exposure to, that from the student usually evolves some questions that we can discuss and talk about, built on what their interest and their knowledge is. So I believe in the inquiry method that can also be very culturally responsive. So to answer the question about keeping our jobs, the idea here, and this also goes with the critical race theory, students have questions, students have concerns, students want to know different things. If our classrooms are structured in a way in which they can ask questions, and then we can decide, well, what kind of research can we do? How can we solve or begin to address these problems in our society? The bottom line is when kids ask questions, when students ask questions, then teachers must teach.
Mm-hmm. I love it. When students ask questions, teachers must teach. I love that as an ethic. as a pedagogical response. Absolutely. Doc, did you have something that you want to say?
Yeah, I wanted just to add that when we talk about how do teachers, what I tell my students, stand in the gap and make sure that they're covering their students. And of course, there are always concerns, especially if you are a teacher that really wants to make sure that schools are doing right by your students. But even when I train in my students, I tell them to, I had a policy when I closed the door to my classroom. That was my world, and when I'm responsible for the children who were in that particular classroom. I think that what needs to happen is that we definitely need to make sure that we have an understanding of what is happening policy-wise, legislation-wise, and determine ways that would best work to make sure that our students are being treated as equitably as possible. There is no one formula for deciding how to protect our students because, as we know, we even are shocked sometimes by the things that we see show up in the news. We must understand that when you close that classroom door, that is your world, and beyond meeting standards and teaching the curriculum and making sure our classroom management is on point. We have a responsibility to protect the children who sit in our classrooms and who attend our schools. So it's going back to that ethos of teaching that Dr. Perry just mentioned. If they ask, we teach, and if they need, we make it happen.
I love it. I love those ethics. I love those approaches. I think they are important. I'm going to return to the question from BCR that asks, how does the anti-CRT legislation contribute to systemic racism? And I just want to start with folks who don't know. Alabama in particular has been one state among many who have pushed for legislation that controls the ways that histories are taught in schools, directly speaking to phrases that we are allowed to use, terminology that we are allowed to use, textbooks that we are allowed to use, ways of teaching and approaches. And they are, in many ways, some legislators, mostly conservative legislators, have sought to what some folks believe is suppress any ideas around American enslavement, around Black history, around culture, around gender, race studies, anything that feels as if it is a deviation from normative teaching. Folks have sought to legislate that. And BCRI is asking, how might this contribute to some of the systemic racism that we see? And so I just want to be very transparent that I have been one of the people who have been fighting against the legislation. In fact, went to the State House recently to speak back against some of this. So very transparent about the fact that I also have been speaking against these issues. But I want to ask you all, do you think that legislation like this will impact teachers and students? And if you do, in what ways will it impact them?
I'll go ahead and start if that's okay. I follow the 1619 Project, and I had an opportunity to listen to Nicole Hannah Jones through at a national convention that I went to virtually. And I had a chance also to really talk about the 1619 Project as well as her book, Born on the Water. And what really resonated with me was this one statement that I'll never forget that I knew, but it was really good to hear. That the African-American experience is a part of the American experience. Mm-hmm. And when we begin to pull the American experience apart, and we decide what is a part and what is not, although it's all a part of the experience, then we're opening up windows and doors that we really don't want to open. Because when people are in power and they decide which history gets taught, then the other history is negated at some point. What we really need to know is that the African American experience was part of the American experience and the American history. So let me go back to that. Yes, I think that by selecting which histories we decide that we will teach, definitely causes a gap in what we understand and how we understand it. I think it's important that we teach all of our histories, and that I actually, let me tell you, the students can handle the history. I think it's sometimes the adults who have trouble with histories. But the students can handle the histories, and they're ready to reconcile and understand and debate and discover and uncover and synthesize and analyze and heal. It's the adults, I think, that have the trouble. And so we've got to recognize that all of our history is American history. And then we should not pull it apart and decide which histories are worth studying and which ones are not. All of it is important and necessary and a part of the experience.
I love it, Doc.
I think Dr. Perry hit the nail on the head. I will say this: anyone who has been in academia and has studied various theories know that it takes time, attention, deep thought, deep reflection. Sometimes people hang on to words. They don't know what it means. They've never read the theory. They don't even know where the theory came from. And it, becomes political, and then it becomes a catchphrase. And then we decide that it needs to go into legislation. And that was not what I think the authors were intending for it to happen. Sometimes people ask about it, and I respond and I said, it's something that needs to be studied and thought about and reflected upon and used appropriately. And so, of course, it's very concerning with the anti-CRT legislation. And I would say for those who are fighting to continue to fight.
Absolutely. As you both know, the news recently has centered around, thank you so much for that. And I think both of you all responded to that incredibly well. Thank you both so much for that power and that courage in those responses. I want to ask, because right now the focus has been on guns. Guns have permeated national consciousness, particularly for the last few weeks. But for the last few years, we have seen pervasive gun violence. We have seen pervasive police brutality, particularly against vulnerable and marginalized communities. And folks have asked, do we need armed police officers in schools, detaining children? Do we need armed guards in schools? Should teachers be armed? Do we need more policing in schools? And I wanted to ask you all what you believe the effect of that has been and what you believe the effect of that will be. Right. So the idea that police and armed guards are everywhere and that guns are everywhere, and should we arm teachers, and should we put more police in schools? Who will be impacted by that? What will be the impact of that? What has been the impact of that? And what are your opinions on that?
I'll give an anecdotal story to this. I actually attended a presentation. I can't remember the name of the scholar who was presenting, but I do remember his field was mathematics. And the presentation was about, racism in the mathematics classroom. But before he started the presentation, the video that he showed was a young lady who was can't remember exactly what had happened before the camera started rolling, but She was African American young lady. She was taken out of her seat, and then by the police officer, and she was slammed to the ground. Okay, this is all captured on video, and this happened in a math classroom. And his point to that presentation was, how do you think that has affected students in terms of their experiences in math, or math in the math classroom? And we had a great discussion about that. And school safety is always a priority, but it should not come at, of course, we should not be, let me say it this way, where is the line between, of course, we want our schools to be safe, especially in if we're thinking about what just recently happened in Texas, and that unfortunate situation. But then there's on the other side where we have these incidences that are happening in public schools where that have been obviously publicized in tapes, where police officers are, again, adultifying our students. And so we have to figure out where's the balance with that. Making sure that all students are safe. I think I'm coming to more of a question than an answer. Where's the line that we have to draw? We want teachers safe. We want students safe. We want administrators safe. We shouldn't be having the issues that we're having, whether we're talking about Columbine, we're talking about what happened in Texas. We shouldn't be having those issues. That's a given. But where is the fine line when we're talking about having an officer responding to a student that like Dr. Perry had said earlier, responding to a student who could just be walked out of the classroom and having a discussion versus coming into the classroom and slamming a child on the ground?
Absolutely.
That's a concern.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doc. Dr. Perry, if you would respond.
Thank you so much for laying the groundwork for that question. And it's not an easy answer. So I just want to say that I do believe in restorative and community practices. I think that schools need to be safe. I think that teachers are there to teach. I don't know if teachers would feel comfortable taking a gun. They're there for something different. Their purpose is different. And to allow them or make them have guns or carry guns is not in line for the job that they took on to do. But let me go back to what restorative practices are and community practices are. I do believe that restorative practices, when we teach our students and our children, that for when there's something that they've done that's not right, or that, because they're still learning, that there's a way to restore the community, that they have to give back in ways that restore the respect and the honor to the community. And I think that why am I harping on that? I think that there's some practices that we have instituted that don't necessarily teach our children how to mitigate conflict. And when we don't teach our children how to mitigate conflict, how to take the answer no, but be okay with it, and that your social emotional well-being is still intact, that it's not always a defense. There are things that we have to do in the upbringing of our children, more social emotional support, counselors in the schools that are not just for assessment, but are really there with a lower caseload to be able to help students. Absolutely. I just think there's so much that we can do before we even get to the point where we have to think about carrying guns.
Absolutely.
I believe in restorative and community practices. But I do believe that if we are going to have people in our schools, then they should be a part of our school community. They should understand our kids. They should know our kids. They should be a part of that community before they carry a gun in that community. Spend some time in the community, be able to go to the grocery store, know the people, no contact, spend time with the parents. There should be a way in which they are already a part of that community and not a stranger to that community, and have to use practices that are that diminish who kids are. you know, in order to make things work. So I'm going to tell you now, I'm not against police officers being in school, but I particularly think their training should really mirror being a member of the community, not on the surface, but really truly a productive member of the community and a part of the community, in ways in which when they make a decision, we know that they're doing it out of care.
Gotcha. Got you. Thank you so much, Doc. I think that answer was brilliant and beautiful. I appreciate what you bring. I think one of the things that I often grapple with as an activist and as an organizer is really what it looks like to make someone safe, what it is for folks to feel safe. I've been thinking a lot also about the same question. I think you both brought in some really important pieces. I think that becoming a part of the community piece is central, is critical. And I think the other idea was, what is the limit of that type of discipline, and how we create a community that is both safe but also affirming, right? One where students feel okay with taking risks and making mistakes without those mistakes being deadly, right? Deadly consequential. It's a hard question, a very difficult question. I love the idea of restorative justice as central to the conversation. Some folks have said, we try restorative justice, but they send the children to the principal and the principal sends us back. And I always remind teachers, like when I give trainings, that was not restorative justice. Restorative justice was about repairing relationships. It was about addressing harm. It was about accountability. It was about learning new lessons for next time. It was about restoring their faith in the relationship between you and them, in the relationship between them and other people. And if that level of restoration isn't happening, that is not genuine restorative justice. That is not real. And so I appreciate this conversation. I want to ask, lastly, closing out on we opened on students. I want to close on students. I want to ask you both, are students aware that these systems are at work in their schools and communities? How have you seen some students resisting this level of violence or disrespect or the racism at schools? And then finally, what is your hope and vision for schools? So I want to start first with that question around students. What have you been seeing with them that says they understand what's happening and they're responding in this way? And then we'll close with your visions.
I think that the students are quite aware of, we can thank social media for that, whether you TikTok or not. They are quite aware of what's going on in this world. They're quite aware of what's going on in this country, and they're quite aware of where inequities lie. They may look at it a little bit differently sometimes than we do when we approach it from an academic standpoint, of course, but they're quite aware of it. And there was a study that was written, and I tell you, most of my work is on African American men and teacher education, but there was a study that I had read that looked at the perspectives of African American boys in high school and where their perspectives lie in terms of becoming teachers themselves. And the responses in that study from those African American boys were very reflective of their thoughts about how they were treated, how they experienced school, why they would not become a teacher because of such. And reading that study made me think about what our students' everyday experiences are and how it's impacting all of the other things that are going on. Even in my work, when I think about recruiting teachers, for instance. And so our students are aware. Sometimes they don't say, but they are definitely aware.
Thank you so much, Dean. Dr. Perry?
I agree wholeheartedly. They are aware, and they see the world around them. They're in it. They're a part of it. And this generation has the ability to see something and then really question and think through it. This idea of inquiry and solving problems, and then being able to involve themselves and being part of the solution. I love it. I'll give an example. There was a young lady that I know who goes to school. She's a young Black woman and goes to a school and wanted to have several guests come to the school who were Black speakers. And then she asked the administration, "This is what I've laid out, and I think this will be wonderful for myself and my classmates." And the response was, "Why is everybody Black?" But the year before, everybody was white and nobody asked a question. Okay. So this young lady, and this has been very recent, this young lady took it upon herself to be proactive and still organize the group of speakers and brought together a panel and presented it to the administration. And because of COVID, there were some other restrictions, but what she did is address the issue.
Absolutely.
She addressed the issue. She became a part of the not part of the problem, but part of the solution. She may not get the out. She may not have in the end gotten the outcome she wanted, which is a full program, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she jumped in there. She saw an injustice. She addressed it and said, "Why did you ask me this?" And then her parents asked the question, "Why did you say this?" You know, the idea here is that the students are aware. They're actively a part of solving the problem. They see things around them. They ask questions. And I love it. This is a very social justice, action-oriented generation. And I believe that they're going to ask these questions. And I think it's the adults who are going to have to be ready to answer for some of the decisions and come up with some answers for them because they want to know. They want to know. Very young. They want to know.
I am overjoyed with the future of youth, particularly young activists and organizers, and even young educators, folks who are hoping to go into teacher education. I am excited about what the future can hold for those youth. And I just want to hear you all's perspectives, your visions. What do you hope for American education? What is your greatest hope for American education? And what is some work that we can follow that is in alignment with your vision? Who are you reading? Who are you watching? Who are you listening to right now? Give us some ideas for what we can keep up with as we push forward towards progressive futures.
Well, I'll just end because I think our time is running very close. I just want to say that I have, as I've said before, such high hopes for our children and what they can do, but I have high hopes also for our teachers. And although our profession doesn't have a lot, we don't have a lot of people going into the profession right now for lots of different reasons, which is a whole nother show. But the idea here that we have talented youth and we have talented future teachers who can come in and make a difference. And I've been following Gloria Ladson Billings has a new book out about culturally relevant pedagogy. Valerie Kinlock in her book about engagement. Of course, Yolanda Celie Ruiz in her work, looking at her theories about racial literacy development. And those are just a few of the pieces on Deidre Dennis Price, Goldie Muhammad with Cultivating Genius, Deidre with Black Girls Literacies as a co-author. Lots of different work about how we can make a difference and how important it is that we listen to our students and that our students already have the voice. We're not giving them anything. It's just teaching them how to use it and them being able to exercise their rights as students and children. I'm very hopeful, Dr. Fowles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry.
So thank you again for having me on. This has been an awesome experience, and I'm definitely enjoyed this conversation. I think Dr. Perry named some of the heavy hitters. Of course, Gloria Ladson Billings. A lot of my work is, as I stated before, is with African American men. So Ivory Tolson, Lisa Delpit is great for anyone who's interested in learning a lot more about working with students who come from different backgrounds in terms of language, ELL, all of that. So, but yeah, I think that, the good thing is we always have someone in the fight. And I think that's what we'll have to continue to do. as a teacher educator, like Dr. Perry said, that it's been difficult getting students interested in becoming teachers and in the profession. But I will say this: once we get them and we train them, and if they come from, especially when they come from some of the backgrounds of the students who they're teaching, they're exceptional. And it is my hope that I can continue, as well as several of my colleagues can continue to train exceptional teachers who can make a difference in public schools.
Love it. This has been such a powerful experience for me. I've learned so much from both of you. It is always an amazing experience to talk to educators, to talk to teacher educators, to talk to folks who are at the forefront of some of the work that we're doing. And so thank you all so much. I want to let the Institute, I want to thank the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute for allowing us this time, for hosting this conversation, and for hosting conversations similarly. I think this conversation, while difficult and while challenging, is important, because these types of critical conversations can push society towards progression, towards transformative justice, towards new ideals for society. And so I am grateful to be in conversation with scholars, with community members, and with folks doing the work. Thank you all again so much for this time, and I hope you enjoyed this hour with us. If you have any questions, please reach out to BCRI, and they can connect you with either the dean or the doctor or doc or myself. And I am excited for the future. So thank you all again, and y'all enjoy your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.